This week I'm joined by Washington Examiner magazine columnist Dominic Green. Dominic, for this week's issue, has written an article looking at how the United Nations is still helping Hamas and the tensions between the Trump administration, the United Nations, and the Israeli government over aid to Gaza. Welcome, Dom.
Hello, Jim.
So, Dom, I think a lot of people would think that it's jarring to hear that the United Nations is helping Hamas, or maybe given the character of the UN, people might not find it this jarring. But walk us through a little bit about the dynamic that you describe in this week's article.
Well, I find it jarring, and I think a lot of people do. And this is a story which has cooked along for many, many years, and which, after the Hamas attacks on Israel on October the 7th, 2023, couldn't be ignored anymore and has become a matter of international interest. On October the 7th, there's a lot of evidence to show that UN employees were among those who had planned and perpetrated this unprecedented horror and were involved in the kidnapping and the management of the kidnapped Israeli hostages. And there are some 13 UN agencies operating in Gaza, and we still don't know the full extent of how they've been operating over a number of years. Particular attention has focused on two agencies, UNRWA, the Reliefs and Works Administration, and more recently, UNICEF. UNRWA is a deeply compromised organization which claimed not to know that Hamas had literally hardwired itself into UNRWA's premises. They literally tapped the electricity from UNRWA headquarters and dug one of their operations rooms into its basement. The particular element of the story that I talk about is to do with food supply. This has been a very controversial issue in recent months, allegations of a humanitarian crisis, which the Israelis deny. And they say Hamas is stealing the food, stockpiling it, and effectively funding its war by selling it onto the Palestinian people in Gaza. And when we are looking at now, what you're seeing is American contractors handing out aid with Israeli soldiers guarding them at 2, and eventually it should be 4 locations in the Gaza Strip. And we've seen occasional scenes of chaos, but also successes in terms of the distribution. Now, one of the mechanisms that's used, UNICEF sends money to a list of pre-approved Palestinians in Gaza, and this list is prepared by the Hamas-run Ministry of Social Development, which is run by a man called Ghazi Hamad, who is on the US Treasury's list of terrorists. He's a proscribed actor. And yet somehow this man has ended up effectively operating in partnership with the United Nations charity. And as documents that NGO Monitor published last week, the British government is more than happy to send money to UNICEF earmarked for the Palestinians in Gaza. And this British government paper showed they were aware that they would effectively be working hand in glove with Hamas in order to do this. And the paper describes reputational damage being a risk, but they went ahead and they did it. And the result is a severe reputational damage. And one of the questions that has arisen really from the very beginning of this war that is still ongoing is, well, if the UN isn't going to do it, who will? And that brings us really to the next question of, can the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is American-Israeli project, replace the operations of the UN in Gaza?
So as you say, Dom, the United States and Israel would like to replace the United Nations role in aid to Gaza. How is that currently going?
Well, the optimist would say that simply recognizing that the United Nations can no longer be trusted is a huge step towards fixing it. The pessimist would point out that this is the Middle East when there is no necessity that anything ever gets fixed or improved. I would say it's very much a mixed bag. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was set up by an ex-Marine called Jake Woods. It's not clear where all the money to fund this substantial amount of aid has come from. He resigned after the New York Times pointed to the organizational background, basically having come from a U.S. security contractor working with Israeli freelancers. The Benjamin Netanyahu was kept purposefully vague about the post-war plans for Gaza, in part to maintain good relations with his Western allies. And so the question of what to do on the day after was effectively passed off to anyone who was interested in it. And they found this American company, Safe Reach Solutions, who then came up with the plan. Now, this is very ad hoc. It's thrown together, and there's a war still going on. The shift to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation operating in Gaza has happened almost simultaneously, while at the other end of the Gaza Strip, the Israelis have stepped up their military actions there. So this is an inherently chaotic situation following on from more than 18 months of inherently destructive warfare, which may well go on for a while. So to expect a rapid transition is I think, unreasonable. To stabilize the position of the civilians in Gaza itself is an achievement. One other question, which I think the US and Israel are sort of on the same page and yet not wholly on, is this question of the political framework. Because whoever controls the aid and whoever controls the charity that goes into Gaza has a crucial influence over the internal politics of Gaza. And at the moment, of course, the internal politics are managed by, whoever has succeeded the last, Hamas leader to have been blown up. So it's, again, a very chaotic system. But the crucial thing is the food and aid will be essential to reconstructing any kind of outcome, whether it's a return to the October the 6th, 2023, whether it's a completely different paradigm of that the Trump administration has talked about, or the Israelis would like to see, or even the Gulf donors would like to see. All of these things depend on creating a new and accountable structure for aid and food delivery. And on this, what's striking to me is that the United States' European allies are very much on the same side in this as the United Nations and Hamas, in fact, because the UN and Hamas have both said that nobody else should be distributing the food. And it is shocking, as you're saying, that all the way through this war, the United States' Western European allies, France and Germany, Britain particularly, have been knowingly contributing funds that inevitably will have gone to support Hamas's war.
So it may be a fool's errand to predict what's going to happen in the Middle East, but where do you see things going next?
Well, I suspect they'll go downhill slowly, which would be a success compared to going downhill quickly. But there will come a point, because there always does, when things will either bottom out or there'll be one of those uneasy truce periods. In the last round of negotiations, which Steve Witkoff was furious about when he thought he had Hamas's agreement, the Israelis had agreed, and Hamas suddenly changed their terms for the latest ceasefire from 60 days to 7 years with various, extra asks. At some point, some kind of political stabilization will occur. The Israelis are adamant that it won't involve Hamas, and it may well not. And again, the framework in which the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is operating also includes, and here it's very difficult to get details, groups operating in Gaza who are not Hamas and seem to be willing to strike a deal with Israel or with the Gulf Arabs or the US, and in other words, alternative patrons to go with alternative food. You can see how these things would add up to some kind of governance. But how long it takes is a very good question, and I couldn't guess, to be honest. I think the Israelis have committed themselves to a necessary but open-ended conflict, and I wouldn't say it necessarily will end soon.
Thank you, Dominic. And you can read Dominic's article and all the stories we've discussed today in the Washington Examiner magazine.